So I hope everybody will be able to see the screen. We will look at the issues of borders and frontiers and look at the historical disputes with China. I will be using a Korean history as a case study, and it is presented by a Korean American political scientist. So he will be using his own Korean heritage as well as understanding in the Western political system to present us a position which we can discuss later on. Now, obviously, we know that Korea and China has a common border. So he will start with the idea of the difference between borders and frontiers, and then we'll take it from there. So let's start.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. I really appreciate it. All of us do who are on this side. And so I first thought I would say hello, 안녕하세요. You've heard a lot about me, but I want to ask a question, which is, why is Korea interesting? There's a number of reasons. Even if we spent a whole week, I wouldn't be able to do all the details of Korea. But I want you guys to take away some of the things that I find most interesting about why Korea is something worth studying. But it is worth trying to figure out why it has been so geopolitically important. True, it's the only place in the world where the interests of the four major superpowers literally touch each other. Here, Korea shares land borders with Russia and China. Its closest relation to Japan is 50 miles by ferry. And of course, as many of you know, the United States had at one time 100,000 troops and nuclear weapons on the peninsula. And now we have 30,000 troops. Is what if we picked up Korea, if we picked it up and we put it in Europe? How big would it be? Because in general, we tend to think of European countries as big and, a lot of these Asian countries as small. So we did the same thing, population and landmass. What's interesting about this chart? Just go ahead and look at it for a minute. I mean, the first thing I would say is Japan is huge, right? With 130 million people, Japan is almost twice the population of Italy, France, UK. Japan is a huge country if we put it in Europe. And a unified Korea would be roughly the same size as all the European countries, 75, 80 million people, and a land mass roughly the same. It's not like UK, Germany, and Italy are over here and Korea's down there. I mean, Korea is a big country if you put it in Europe. The problem for Korea, and frankly for Japan, is that this is a false map, because this is really what East Asia looks like. That's Japan down there. That's Thailand. Korea is the 48, right? South Korea. China is huge. China is a continent-sized country. So of course, compared to China, everybody's small. It's the same way as the United States, right? We are a continent-sized country. I want to start with a question, which I don't expect you to be able to answer. But how many times did Japan and China invade Korea? Does anybody know? The popular perception is that Korea has just been constantly invaded. We're the small country, the big countries do whatever they want. And I'm going to give you a different story, actually, and one that shows a lot more stability in East Asia, which for those of you who do world history or whatever else, is actually, I think, one of the most interesting things about East Asian history, is how it actually worked, right? Because if we go to Europe, and we all know this, right? The history of Europe is a blood-soaked series of unending wars against each other. From the 100 Years' War, the 7 Years' War, the, just on and on and on, right? Napoleon, Trafalgar, etc. In Europe, you had a bunch of similarly sized states, kingdoms, whatever, that spent centuries beating the stuffing out of each other. And the best way to show this is if you put a map. So this is Europe in 1300. And we have a whole bunch of political units here that don't exist anymore, right? So there's a Crown of Castile or Genoa and Savoy, Duchy of Guienne, whatever, right? A whole bunch of political units. And in fact, the Europe that we know today really didn't even begin to come into focus until the 19th century. So Europe by 1800 is beginning to look like Spain and Portugal, but you still have Sardinia, you still have Naples, the Kingdom of Naples, Torino, Helvetic Republic, the Ottoman Empire. So borders in Europe changed constantly as kingdoms rose and fell and people conquered each other and moved back and forth. The Europe that we know today is actually really recent. Now, in contrast, in East Asia, the four main states of East Asia, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, and China, have basically existed for well over 1,000 years. Their borders changed a little bit, but these are identifiably the same units. And so Korea became Korea around the 7th century. Now, there's a lot of historical debate over this kingdom called Goguryeo. But essentially, there were three kingdoms on the Korean peninsula. Before then, the Baekje, Shilla, and Goguryeo. This Kaya was a smaller thing. Before then, around 200 AD, there were a bunch of little tribes, things back and forth. These kingdoms developed around 200, so that by 600 AD, you had basically three large kingdoms. Yamato Japan, the Japanese state that we know today, it roughly traces its emergence to around the 6th or 7th century. Before then, again, just a bunch of little tribes or something. But there we can trace a political heritage. Now, the interesting thing is that here there was a world war. There was a world war, meaning everybody who could be involved was involved. Right? So the Japanese allied with Baekje, Shilla allied with Tang China. Shilla and Tang crushed Goguryeo. They then beat up Baekje, and the Japanese sent some troops, they sent them home. So there was a massive war, a couple decades. And when the dust settled, you basically had the beginnings of a unified Korean political unit, which covered 2/3 of the peninsula, around 700 AD. And that political unit basically sort of pushed northwards, so that by the 10th century, the border with China was this thing called the Yalu River. So you still have unified Shilla, and it sort of pushed northwards. By the Chosun dynasty of 1400, they had basically filled out to what it looks like today. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit. Because this region up here, as you may or may not know, the Manchurian region is basically wilderness. It's really cold, it's desolate, it's big mountains, nobody really lives there. So the border that did get demarcated by 1000 AD was the Yalu River. This was the most important border because this is where people from Korea went over to China to trade, and they went back and forth. Up here, it's just a bunch of wilderness. And over the centuries, the frontier began to turn more and more into a border. So now there's the Yalu and the Tumen rivers. And this right here is, again, wilderness mountains. And that was settled and demarcated between China and Korea in the 18th century, 1711. Now, why is this interesting? Literally 1,000 years, this river has been the border between China and Korea. That's an astonishing amount of stability between two recognizably political units that exist today. The same thing actually in Vietnam. Vietnam and China, Proto-Vietnam at the time, demarcated a border with China at Lan Song. In 1999, when they did the formal modern treaty with the border, it's this exact same place that it had been since basically the 10th century. That's an astonishing amount of stability between political units. They expanded in other directions into frontiers, but between these political units, an enormous amount of stability. These are deeply, deeply long-lived kingdoms with a sense of who they are and a sense of difference from someone else. So how is this actually different from East Asia? In some ways, this is what we call the tribute system, right? There was a set of ideas out there that are very different from modern sense of how you do international relations. I mean, the best example of it is that woven through our ideas of international relations and domestic politics is the idea of equality, right? This is a Enlightenment notion, French Enlightenment notion from the 17th century. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. It's also from, of course, the way that we think about international relations. Once you are a nation state and you're granted diplomatic recognition and you send ambassadors, everybody's the same. So the United States is formally the same as a tiny country like Bolivia. And that's not to criticize Bolivia, but Bolivia is 2 million people. On nothing are they the same in terms of size, power, wealth, anything. 2 million people, 300 million people, right? We've got nuclear weapons, they don't. They're not the same at all, except we're called nation states. So this idea of equality is deeply woven through international relations and in terms of our domestic politics. But as I heard briefly mentioned before, East Asia has a very different historical sense of international relations and what we would call as hierarchic, not equality, which sort of intuitively it wouldn't be. Why would you think that they're the same? They're not the same, but rather a rank order. And the interesting thing is that in Europe, you had an idea of equality, formal equality, informal inequality, because of course there was some countries were bigger, more powerful than others, and endless fighting. And in East Asia, you had formal hierarchy, formal ranking of countries. Informally, the big countries, China, left everybody alone. They didn't really interfere in South Korean or Korean domestic politics at all. So informal equality and centuries of stability. There were sort of two basic norms or practices. One is called investiture, and then the other was just cultural learning. And investiture was basically going through the motions of going to the Chinese emperor and saying, do you approve of me being king? So you send some diplomats to China. The emperor says, of course you're gonna be king. Here's a bunch of gifts. You go home. And the Chinese emperor leaves you alone. Right? Formally, you're saying, yeah, you're an emperor. I'm only a king. But informally, the Chinese didn't care. They just wanted to make sure you understood where the rank order was. Also informally, of course, China at the time was the center of civilization and learning throughout that region. So in many very interesting ways, Koreans were happy to copy. Language, up until the invention of the Korean alphabet, and even to this day, Koreans use Chinese characters to write. It was a sign of education, in fact, right? Even if you learn the Korean indigenous way of writing, which is much easier, precisely because it was a local indigenous way of writing, it was considered more educated and more sophisticated to be able to write in Chinese characters. And everybody around the region used them. There's an examination system. The best way to move up, again, this is very Confucian. Education was the most important thing. Being a rich trader was not. But everybody wanted to be a student of the Confucian classics and get into the government service by passing the civil service exam. It was the only method for social mobility in Korea that was introduced. It's actually, I saw that downstairs. It was introduced roughly in the 9th century. And that was the way that everybody got to be successful. And it's one of the historical roots for why education is so important in Korea today. For centuries, that was the way to success. Being a trader wasn't, being a general was not. There used to be a military exam along with the civil service exam, but it fell into disuse because the military wasn't being used a lot.
There used to be a military exam along with the civil service exam, but it fell into disuse because the military wasn't being used a lot.
Now, what makes this so interesting is there's a set of ideas out there. There's a set of goals. As long as everybody knows where they fit, everything's fine. And a lot of cultural buy-in from Korea, from China. Now there's indigenous Korean culture as well. Don't get me wrong. There's a deeply indigenous Korean culture, which is not Confucian, which is not hierarchic, which is earthy, egalitarian, and whatever else. And we're going to come back to this. So it wasn't a wholesale copying of Chinese culture any more than, for example, Mexico or Europe is borrowing wholesale from American culture. We're number one today, and people sort of like to borrow some stuff. Everyone wants to learn English, but that doesn't mean they all want to become American and act all like us. But the interesting thing about this, and I heard it again mentioned, is this war, because this is the exception that in some ways proves the rule. In 1592, in the Imjin Weran, this Japanese general Hideyoshi decided he was going to invade China, and to get there, he had to go through Korea. So, what did he do? He invaded, at one point, it was almost 200,000 soldiers. They crossed these 50 miles of water on 700 ships and invaded Korea. Korea defended with 60,000 troops. Yi Sun-shin had turtle boats, mercilessly cut their supply lines. And the Chinese ultimately sent, at first they didn't believe the Koreans. Like, you're kidding me. The Japanese are invading us? But eventually they sent troops and helped defend Korea. That was a world war also at the time. Now, what's interesting about this is about the same time, 1588, in Europe, there was the Spanish Armada. You guys have heard of that, right? The Spanish Armada has been called, let me make sure I get this right, the greatest military force ever assembled in Renaissance Europe when the Spanish tried to invade England. And they invaded with about 30,000 troops, and they were defeated by about 20,000 English troops. The point is, the war in East Asia was about 5 to 10 times the scale that Europe could even imagine creating. And now this is really interesting because not only did this war dwarf the scale of European wars. I mean, when these guys decided to fight, they could do it on a scale you could not imagine in Europe. They had the logistical, military, organizational capacity to get together hundreds of thousands of soldiers. So when they decided to fight, they could really fight. And yet, in some ways, this is the only war between the three of these for about 12 centuries. There was that World War I told you about at the beginning, you know, in Goguryeo, when we ended up with the sort of unified Korea. And then you get to 1894, 1870, depending on when you want to call, when the Japanese and Chinese began fighting again. And in between, there's only one war. But they clearly could do it. It's not that they couldn't take 100,000 guys and go across water. And so the question must be, why didn't they fight? And that's what I get to, you know, I talk a lot more in my book. Why didn't they fight more? But also just the mere fact that there weren't that much more fighting is worth noting, especially when we start to compare it to Europe and the incessant invasions between France and Europe. At that time, I actually counted up between 1300 and 1900, there were 43 times that France and England were involved in wars, right? So this is actually quite interesting, right? So why? These are old, powerful, organized countries. These aren't just a bunch of scattered tribes walking around not fighting with each other. And that's, in many ways, a fascinating type of question. Yes?
But weren't there lots of debates, like between China and Korea, and then like Japan invading the pirates on like being China? I mean, there was a lot of.
Well, there's a difference, right? Between pirate invasions, which aren't military, right? What are the pirates normally? I mean, this is actually interesting. Wegu is the title for it, right? Wegu is that woku, I guess is the Japanese word. These were small, they're not pirates like pirates of the Caribbean, right? One guy on a boat. Usually it's a family, half traders. When trade was difficult, then they would turn to piracy. So absolutely they could be consequential, right? What would usually happen is it's a raid on a town or something like that, and then somebody leaves. That's very similar to the border wars that America fought for a long time on its borders. Why we created the USS Constitution, right, was to go fight the Barbary Coast pirates, you know, the marine thing, right, from the halls of, you know, to the shores of Tripoli, right? So yes, they're consequential, but we tend to think of wars being government organized, hundreds of thousands of troops, and the pirates they were always a nuisance, the same way they're a nuisance now. But we don't think of the Somali pirates right now as being wars either, right? So yeah, and there's another point that I make. I mean, I could talk about history the whole time, because partly what we're doing then and partly what we're doing now, my one sentence history of the world, we have enough time for this, right? Actually, let me ask you this. Let me ask you this right here. For anybody, what's the difference between a frontier and a border? Uh-huh. Absolutely, right? A border is a line and a frontier is a space. we have political control here, it peters out. Then there's some anarchy, and over there somewhere there's, you begin to get political control. And a border is very clear. It's like, I stop here, you start there. My one sentence history of the world, not to insult the history teachers, process of turning frontiers into borders. We're trying to do that today in California. We're trying to draw a line that doesn't, the social and cultural ecology of Mexico and California is like this. But we are trying to create a line that's like this. That's pirates, smugglers, drug dealers, immigrants, etc., right? And we tend to think of that as different than the organization of an attempt to conquer the political unit on the other side, right? Where we're going to mobilize an army and send it over to wipe out the other country. And so this is what's interesting. When we talk about these major mobilizations, we have very few. In the interest of time, let me just keep going on, right? Because that all ended in the 20th century. These centuries of stability disappeared with the arrival of the West and the transformation of East Asia, which had been a very stable international system with extensive trade, with militaries, with countries, trading, diplomats, whatever else. But it was done one way. And then almost overnight, within the space of a generation, the arrival of the West. Now, why is this interesting? Literally 1,000 years, this river has been the border between China and Korea. That's an astonishing amount of stability between two recognizably political units that exist today.
Okay, that was the presentation. I'm going to also show you another video. This is about the changing borders in Europe. So let me just get this set up first, and then come on. Okay, go here. So stop this share, and then share another screen for you. This one. Now, we are going to look at how borders in Europe change over time. We start at 1100. Okay. So you have seen the difference between the Europe and East Asia. So let's go to our discussions. Before we start describing, I think I want to emphasize one point. It's about equality. What do we mean by equality? As noted in the video, we believe that men are created equal. Is that really true? Unfortunately, men are not created equal. When we are born into different families. their family wealth are different. Some are born into rich, very rich families, like prince or princesses, or some, like myself, born into a very poor family. Some are born into a very worst time of history. Maybe the country was fighting a war. Some others are born into very good times. Everything is going on well, like the current generations in China. Those born in the 2000 or 2010s are born into a very prosperous China. Again, some people are born with healthy body. Others are born with disabled body, etc., etc. So we cannot say men are born equal. We are not. Only by recognizing that we are born not equal, then our social policy can take care of the unfortunate people among us. So I do deeply believe that by promoting the notion of equality and then left the people to their own means is not the best society we wish to live in. We recognize that, yes, some people are born fortunate, some are unfortunate, and therefore we need to adjust our social policy so that those who are unfortunate, either because of environment, because of physical abilities, or any other unfortunate events, they are being looked after. East Asia has been stable for thousands of years, as explained using Korea as an example, is that we recognize countries are not the same size. China is a continental country. Population-wise, is also large. China today has about 1.3 to 1.4 billion people. The next one is India. But after that, the third is only about 300 to 400,000. 300 to 400 million. It's about 3 to 4 times more people just in India and China. China represents about a quarter of the world population. India, another 1/4. The rest is divided into the 200 countries in the world. Of course, some countries are very, very small. Solomon Island is very small. Australia has only about 20-something million people, not even the size of Shanghai. But we say we are equal to everybody else. We are equal even to China, which is 1.3 to 1.4 billion people. I think that is not the right way to look at the world. We should recognize that there are countries which are big, both in terms of population, in terms of land size, as well as its ability. For example, at the moment, American is still the predominant political unit in the world. Its currency is being used as international currency in trading, in reserve currency, etc. And American has over 800 military bases all around the world. American is exerting a huge political dominance over the world. Even if we include the West into the equation, put European Union in the same basket, as well as United Kingdoms and United States of America, that only represent about 11% of the world population. So if we want to understand the world, we might have to switch our lens from a predominantly Western lens into a more Eastern view, as described by the video. Eastern Asia has been quite peaceful for a very long time, despite if circumstances arise, can motivate and can send out armies 5 to 10 times of those from Europe. But why? Why Eastern Asia can maintain this stability and peace? I think what we want to do in the coming century, we know that we cannot engage in world war, because if nuclear power are engaged in nuclear war, humanity is doomed. We will not survive the Third World War. So we need to look at new ideas and new political system that can make sure that we can survive. So with these remarks, I open up for discussion. Anyone? It's a bit political, but I think we are all mature, so we can respect other people's different opinion. So we can discuss things objectively. Yes, anyone?
Albert, I was fascinated by the short overview of Korean history, but I feel I've had very little teaching on the history of East Asia, but my understanding is that the history of China has been considerably less peaceful than the picture that was presented for Korea. Would it be possible to have a similar presentation on China and its frontiers and borders and its relations with its neighbors?
Yep. Yeah, I will endeavor to do so, and that is a very good suggestion. So next year I have already fixed the topics for first term next year. So we'll cover that in second term.
That would be great.
Yeah, thank you. So let me just write down China's dynasty changes. Okay, now put it this way. The average duration of a Chinese dynasty is about 230 or 250 years. That's the average duration. Some are much shorter, some are much longer. For example, our Song dynasty, our Tang dynasty is something 300 something years long. The shortest dynasty probably is our first emperor, the Chen Shi Huangdi. His emperor lasted only 49 years. The largest empire in the world, the Mongol Empire during our Yuan dynasty, lasted in China 99 years. So there are large, intense growth of a political unit, and then collapse very quickly. But on the other hand, there are also political units like those in our Tang dynasty and the Song dynasty. They are not expanding very much. They are keeping pretty stable, but they were stable for a long, long time, talking about 200 years, 300 years. Even our Qing dynasty lasted almost 200 years. So I think that is something we can show you with a little bit of research, make sure the numbers are correct. This is only out of my brain, so it's only rough. I can't guarantee all the numbers are correct, but I will do the presentation with some preparation next term. The Chinese consider a stable government as the good times. In between dynasties, then we are considered as worst time. And a good government is a stable government which do not endeavor in military expansion. The Chinese expansion, yes, there are military expansions, but up to a certain point, as discussed in the video, the border between Korea and China has been stable for almost 1,000 years. The border between Vietnam and China is also stable for almost 1,000 years. Yes, China expanded into today's huge continent, but that expansion took over 2,500 years to expand to that size. In between, I would say the warring times, the number of years when there are some infighting or civil war within China, over the peaceful time where the political units are stable, would be about 1 to 5, rather than the case in Europe is almost 1 to 0 or 1 to 1. So China is very stable, but don't hold me on the numbers at the moment because I need to do the research to make sure my numbers are correct. Okay, anyone else?
I'd like to just go off to a little tangent briefly. I like your idea that men are not created equal, but as a woman, I would rather you said people are not created equal.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. And understand, we are not created equal, put it that way.
Yep, I agree.
Yeah, and then so are countries.
Yes.
Some countries are large, some countries are small, and only by recognizing that there are different size of countries, then we can start thinking of a stable system in which we don't need to fight. Rather, we can negotiate and we can coexist. So the next year, the first term, I will be dealing with something in this sense, because as you might know, the CPC 20th National Congress just opened yesterday. Xi Jinping gave a 2 hours summary of what he had done in the last 10 years and look forward to the next 5 years. So that will be the main topic in first term next year, because although he has given his speech, but the formal version, which is much longer, is still being debated. So it had to be after the National Congress actually go through the whole government report. Then we will see the finalized government report, and then I will base it on the government report rather than the verbal presentation by Xi Jinping. So that will be next year. Another issue is, of course, at the moment we have a war between Ukraine and Russia. You will have remember from the videos after the Korean history, Ukraine existed as a country for a very short time in the last 1,000 years. Most of the time, Ukraine was occupied by either Poland or another empire, or Russian Empire, or USSR, and so forth. It only existed as a country recently since the collapse of the Soviet Union. during the division of the Soviet Union into its different entities, Ukraine has a very good share of the wealth of the USSR. It has the ability to build aircraft carriers. The first aircraft carrier from China was bought from Ukraine. They show the skeleton of a aircraft carrier, which haven't been fully installed from Ukraine. Ukraine also has the world's largest airplane. Unfortunately, this airplane is now destroyed. Ukraine soil is a dark soil, a black soil, making Ukraine one of the largest producer of wheat. The number one producer of wheat is China. The number two is India. The number three is United States or Russia. I can't remember which one. And then that means Russia and United States are number 3 and 4. And then the number 5 is Ukraine. Unfortunately, China and India, although it is largest producer of wheat, but they are not the largest exporter of wheat. The largest exporter of wheat is United States, followed by Russia, or the other way around, and then followed by Ukraine. Now the special military operation in Ukraine make the world a very difficult place at the moment. Russia, not Russia, Europe is suffering from lack of energy by censoring the energy from Russia. So they get themselves into an awkward situation at the moment. So how the world will look like is everybody's guess at the moment. The Northern Hemisphere's winter, this winter, is going to be a very difficult time for people in Europe and probably in the rest of the world as well. So this will be covered next year under the title of Xi Jinping's notion of a once 100 years incident in the world. We are seeing a tectonic change of the world political system, probably in the next 10 to 50 years. That's my belief. I hope I can convince you that we are going into a very different times next year by this series of presentations. Anyone else? Any problem? Any question? Yes, unmute yourself first, please.
We are definitely in a very difficult time. Definitely.
Yeah.
Mm.
Our inflation is high, energy cost is high.
The whole
And
world.
the whole world is not stable at the moment. It's
Yeah.
very, very,
Very sad. Yeah.
Anyone else, please? No? I hope today's presentation can stimulate everybody to look at the politics of today and some of the assumptions that our political system made. So one assumption is about democracy. We all like democracy. We all like our government to be able to respond to our needs. But can we equate democracy, which is an ideal way that we are governed, with voting? Is there other ways to have a government which can respond to our needs and lead us through tough times like today. Is voting the only way to achieve that? If not, then what are the alternatives?
Well, maybe another question is, are governments actually ruling the world?
Sorry again?
Are
Our
governments actually ruling the world?
our
Is any-
government actually ruling the world?
Yeah.
Uh,
or is it business, big business, for example?
or do we want a government to rule over the world? Should we also think about governments only ruling over its own?
Can I interrupt one moment, Albert? I shouldn't have said ruling the world, but are governments actually ruling people?
Yes, yeah. When we use ruling people, that means the government is considered as an entity separate from the people, and this government is applying a coercion force over the people. I think that is ruling. But if we consider government as the people themselves, so that's why I say how we organize ourselves. I don't say government is ruling. I say we want a government is a different word, a different organization which help us to organize ourselves. I want to draw back to the first principle. Do we need a government? And if we need a government, what this government has to do to meet its obligations that we have a government?
Do we have a choice?
Good question. Now, let me give you an example. During the period of colonizations, our Aborigines in Australia here, or the Aborigines in New Zealand, in America, the local people, okay, the people who were there for a long time, they haven't got a political structure as powerful as the Western nations at that time. For example, Portugal, the Spain, United Kingdom, and so forth.
I think that's a little unfair. They didn't have an army as strong as the Western.
They haven't got an army, yes. And therefore, that means these people are loose organization to organize their daily lives, okay? For example, I don't think our Aborigines is fighting each other all the time. People have their relationships with their family and so forth, but their organization size is much, much smaller than those as a country, as a kingdom. United Kingdom, for example. Even for a country as large as China, at that time, China still has a huge population, probably again about a quarter of the world's population. But it was almost colonized by the Western countries. China has a strong political power. The Qing dynasty is a pretty strong political power. But people under that situation, under that government, still suffers from colonizers' war machines. So when we talk about how to organize ourselves, one way I would like to describe it is We want the organization, whatever they call, we may call it a government. Okay, let's call it a government. That organization, which we have generated to organize ourselves, will provide protection to the people against two things. One, natural disasters like earthquake, volcano activities, weather extremes, etc., etc. Of course, we can't avoid natural disasters, but we want the government to offer help when natural disasters strike. For example, we have flooding in New South Wales a couple months ago, and we have flooding at the moment in some part of Victoria, right? What we want our government to offer help to these people against natural events. We can't avoid natural events, but when that natural events occurs, we want our government to be able to offer help to those people affected. So that is one thing I think any government need to do. The second is things done by other people against people. Okay, that would include domestically, of course, crimes. We don't want to get robbed. We want to have a safe environment. We want to be able to walk out to the street and knowing that I can come back home safely. We don't want violence against ourselves. So in one way, government have to ensure that we are safe. People within the country can live lives to the best effort. So that is again another protection. It's protection against human crimes. Domestically, human crimes, but internationally, it's war between countries. Sometimes, due to a few leaders' ambition, our whole country is mobilized to fight a war with another country, causing huge human suffering. War is human suffering, no doubt about that. Any kinds of war is human suffering. But sometimes, due to some political leaders' ambition, sometimes due to misunderstanding between governments, sometimes due to so-called national pride, I think we can swallow all that and avoid human suffering, and government should do that. So asking a question, do we need a government? Yes, I think so. Without a government, look at Aborigines here, look at the Indians in America. They suffer because they don't have a strong government to protect them against some leaders' ambitions. But what else? What else do we want our government to do? I think next time I want to go back to this first principle. Look at how we want to organize ourselves, how we human develop to the current state of civilization. How should we organize ourselves?
My question wasn't so much do we need a government, but how much power do the governments that we have actually have, and how many decisions are actually being made by other forces?
Good question.
Yeah.
I agree with you. Very true. I think we need a government who really governs for the people instead of our government is government by somebody else as well, I think.
Yeah, I think there are two things here. One thing is the government working for the interests of the people, or the government is working for the interests of those who supported the government? Obviously, what we see today is most government is working for those who supported the government, for example, through donations or other means. And I think we jump up with the idea of whether we are now being ruled by corporates, international large groups of money, and that money moves between different political units, and then they are seeking to grow their wealth. Can we take this huge wealth and then make sure that it is not working against the people, and make sure that they work for the people, no matter where they want to go to? At the moment, it seems that there are countries where this big, huge money can go to, and then cannibalize the economy, increase its wealth, and then move to another country and do the same. We are seeing these patterns going on at the moment. So one thing I think we need to promote is the government needs to work for the people, not for its supporters. Any other comments?
That's all I have.
Some good questions. So I think what this presentation want to do is actually stimulate a different look at our political system, and then go back to first principle. What do we want about our political environment? We will touch upon how to change that maybe in the future, but at the moment, I think at least we start to reimagine how humans can organize ourselves to solve problems which only can be solved by the whole human cooperation, like climate, like environment, like elimination of poverty, like elimination of war. These are global problems. No more question?
Well, thank you very much, Albert.
In that case, we will close this area. And next week, we will do armchair traveling into different parts of China, which normal tourists will not visit.
Yeah,
Only-
I have
That
to say,
would be interesting.
Yeah, so should be. So
just-
this term is a mixed bag. We have something looking at 100 years ago's China last week. This week we look at the politics, and next week we will look at some armchair traveling. Next year, the first term will be the free presentation will be politics.
I'd just like to explain that we are enrolled for next week, but we have a clash with something else.
Yeah, I will send out the recording of this presentation after next week. So you will notice that the system tell you it is being recorded. So I will do the recording, and then I will ask the course coordinators to send out the address for the videos, so you can always look at it after I upload it into the YouTube.
Thank you very much for that.
Okay, thank you, and see you next week.
Thank you, Albert.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.